Hello and good morning, everyone. We are now on the second week. If Exodus was in tenths, then we have started we have finished 10%, and now we're starting the next 1/10 portion of Exodus, reading 40 chapters during the 40 days of Lent. Before I get started in this video, I need to look backward and respond to something and acknowledge something. In my video Saturday, I mistakenly said that it was Moses that was being circumcised, when in fact it was his son that was being circumcised. Thank you to someone for alerting me of that. It was Moses had not been clearly while in Midian. Moses, his son, what seems to be raised more as a Midianite rather than a Hebrew. Of course, that would make sense because Moses was raised as more of an Egyptian rather than as a Hebrew himself. And so I don't favor making excuses for the errors of my speech. Albeit, when I recorded that video, it was 4 a.m. I was sitting outside of a Waffle House in Columbia, South Carolina, in a parking lot, trying to make a video with the computer on my lap, and I was so fatigued that somebody else had to alert me then by 8 o'clock that they had not received the video. I did everything but press send. Okay, so we'll move forward now into the second 10th of the book, chapter number 5. So Aaron and Moses are going to go to Pharaoh, and initially it looks like their request is a little less specific. God said, release his people that they may hold a pilgrimage feast in the wilderness. Many of your English Bibles will say to worship him in the wilderness. The Hebrew word there is not the common word for worship. It's more appropriately the word for a pilgrimage feast. And so remember, Pharaoh, who has wanted to exploit the people with hard labor, now they're asking for some sort of rest, a holiday, a vacation. And Pharaoh is looking at them and says, who is this Lord that I should obey him? I don't know this Lord, and I will not release Israel. Throughout Scripture, the leader of the great empire of the day is usually seen as viewing himself as the highest authority on earth and in heavens, and in juxtaposition to God. And here, Moses and Aaron are going to make their petition a little more clear here. Verse number 3, God has met with us, wants us to do a 3-day journey in the wilderness so that we can sacrifice. And we'll be avoiding a plague this way. So now they're making it detailed. We want a 3-day vacation. Seems reasonable for all the work that they have been doing. However, Pharaoh recognizes that this is a petition. This is something new. This is something different. If he honors this petition, what is he going to have to honor next? And in verse number 4, it makes clear what Pharaoh's concerns and interests are is the labor of the people and a lack of productivity if they should take any kind of holiday. And Pharaoh assesses it that they really want a rest from their labor rather than to actually go and worship. So Pharaoh has to respond. And, throughout all societies and cultures, there's been labor tensions at one time or another. And so here is Pharaoh here. He's going to draft a policy to respond to this. And of course, as we see and as we know, rather than drafting a policy of kindness, he is going to draft a policy that further exploits the people. They're going to have to continue to make bricks with the same quota. However, now, rather than having other laborers, presumably Egyptian or perhaps other ethnic slaves, to gather their straw for them, they're going to have to gather their own straw and make the same amount of bricks, do a bit more work, but meet the same quota. It's clearly within the same time frame. Again, this is punishment for asking to go and worship God. And in verse 8 here, they are called lazy, or they're called slackers. What Pharaoh is accusing them of is being lazy here, and so he's going to work them harder. So verses 10 through 14 records the Egyptian slave masters going to the Hebrew foreman and conveying to them this new policy. And in verse 15, there's a interesting parallel. Back in the close of chapter 2, I think it was, the Hebrews were crying out to God, and now in verse 15, they are crying out to Pharaoh. Why are you doing this to us? We're working hard. We've been faithful laborers. Why are you doing to this? We take your beatings, even in verse 16. But now what you're asking us to do is something that is not feasible. Pharaoh says you are lazy. This is why you want to take a break, go sacrifice to God. And so I'm going to punish laziness with making the work harder. And, of course, the people are upset. They go to Moses and they blame Moses and say, may God judge you because you have made Pharaoh's opinion of us stink, is the literal Hebrew. It has gone to the lowest of the low. Pharaoh has no more regard for us. And in fact, two things are interesting there in those verses 20 and 21. First, it mirrors, I think it's chapter 2, when Moses tries to intervene, and the Hebrews say, who made you a ruler or judge over us? And here they're asking, they are resisting Moses and saying, may God judge you. Secondly, they are accusing Moses of giving Pharaoh an excuse to kill them. Well, when we've looked in chapter number 1 and in chapter number 2, Pharaoh did not need an excuse to kill them. Pharaoh was already killing them, but of course, in the weight of this mental stress and emotional turmoil, they are turning on Moses. So the conclusion of this chapter, Moses returns to God and says, why have you even asked me to do this? Why are you trying to start trouble? You're not rescuing your people. Things are getting worse. And so this is a consistent, persistent plea and cry throughout Scripture. When God raises up servants for a variety of deeds and tasks, and God gives a promise and a vision of redemption, yet these things do not come in a fast-forward motion. They certainly do not come immediately. And so there's the promise and the hope, and then the intermediate period where things frequently seem to be working awkward. And that's true throughout the corpus of Scripture. And definitely here in Exodus. There's a promise, the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey, yet simultaneously there's a great deal of struggle in order to reach that land. And of course, many of you already know the story, of course, and that there's trouble brewing now. Nothing can seem to be easy in the book of Exodus. Maybe that's a broader theme that we'll continue to highlight. Nothing can be easy. And so now the curtain falls, scene 5 has concluded, and we ask ourselves a principled question here. What will happen next? Is God going to relent? Is God going to keep his promise? And if so, how will God keep his promise? And what about this Pharaoh? This Pharaoh, he has essentially given God an honor challenge and tested God. And so Now the proverbial battle lines are drawn and set, and so I'll meet you again tomorrow as we continue these 40 chapters of Exodus during the 40 days of Lent, as we resume with chapter number 6. Thank you all.